Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Daniels, and I'm the Radon Program Manager for the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. And today I'm going to present on some of the most radioactive places and how smoking and radon relate to those most radioactive places. In disclosure, I do work for the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and as a state agency, we do receive from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency what's known as the State Indoor Radon Grant annually, and that grant's purpose is to perform public outreach and radon risk reduction. And I'm going to go over today, I'm going to start out with a video, and I'll explain that in a minute about the most radioactive places on Earth, and then we'll talk about radiation sources in cigarettes, and then I'll briefly talk about some of the international U.S. smoking rates and how they affect that radiation exposure, and then finally I'll talk about radon's role in radiation to the lung. We routinely, as a state agency, the general public will ask us questions, even health professionals will ask us questions about what are some of the most radioactive places on Earth. And so I was doing a training course, and one of the students one time mentioned this video, and so I took the time to watch it. It's by Derek Mueller. He has his PhD in physics education research at the University of Sydney, a BS in engineering physics from Queen's University in Canada, and he's the creative director and CEO of ThoughtWorks out of Sydney, Australia. And some of us here in the U.S. might know him best because he's appeared on the Netflix television program Bill Nye Saves the World. And his website is Veritasium. Veritas is a Latin word, and Veritasium is a channel of science and engineering videos featuring experiments, expert interviews, some cool demos, and discussions with the public about everything in science. So so how this relates is we do get asked about some of the, what are the general public's most likely sources of radiation exposure. And when you talk to the general public, they're always going to mention a couple of things. And if we think about our lifespans, depending on your age, some people will know about the use of atomic weapons. Some remember the accident of 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or the Fukushima power plant more recently in Japan. And some may know a little bit about uranium exploration and uses of uranium and mill tillings around the country, and they'll mention that. So this is a video put together by Dr. Mueller that actually goes over some of those and explains and hopefully puts in perspective what some of those different radiation risks. So without that, I'll go ahead and start the YouTube video here. If you bear with me as we pull it up from YouTube.
So on that boot, it's overloaded.
Radiation is frightening. At least certain types of it are. I mean, my Geiger counter doesn't go off near my mobile phone or the Wi-Fi router or my microwave. That's because a Geiger counter only measures ionizing radiation. That is, radiation with enough energy to rip electrons off atoms. And it's measured in units called sieverts. If you're exposed to more than 2 sieverts all at once, you'll probably die shortly after that. But we're exposed to low levels of ionizing radiation all the time. Bananas, for example, are rich in potassium, and some of that potassium is naturally radioactive. So when you eat a banana, you're actually exposed to about 0.1 microsieverts of radiation. That's 1/10,000,000th of a sievert. Let's use a banana for scale of radiation doses. You know, since people eat bananas, we become radioactive too. So you're actually exposed to more radiation if you sleep next to someone than if you sleep alone. But I wouldn't worry about that, because that dose is insignificant compared to the natural background radiation of Earth. I mean, there's ionizing radiation coming out of the soil and the rocks and the air and even from space. The level of radiation here in Sydney is about 0.15 microsieverts per hour. And that's about average globally. The level's usually between 0.1 and 0.2 microsieverts per hour. But there are places with significantly higher levels. So who on Earth do you think receives the maximum dose of ionizing radiation? Let's answer that question by going to the most radioactive places on Earth. Some places you'd expect to have high levels of radiation might surprise you. I'm in Hiroshima, and that is the Peace Dome. It was about 600 meters above that dome where the world's first nuclear bomb was detonated over a city. It was detonated there to have maximum destructive impact. With a level of radiation today, almost 70 years later, is only 0.3 microsieverts per hour.
I'm about to get into an elevator. We're going down the mine shaft. This is an old uranium mine.
This is the mine where uranium was discovered. It's also the place where Marie Curie obtained her raw material.
1.7 microsieverts per hour. It's about 10 times the natural background that you would have.
Nowadays, most of the uranium has been removed. But in this wall, there's still a small piece, and you can see under UV light, it fluoresces.
Look at that. Fluorescent uranium ore.
This is the lab of Marie Curie. She won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in physics and one in chemistry. And she conducted a lot of her work here. And this is her office. She would have sat right there. Apparently there are only a few parts of this area which are still radioactive. One is this doorknob.
Well, it climbs not much,
But that's like 10 times the background.
yes, more than 10.
And another is the back of her chair. You can still detect alpha particles coming off this spot right here. Apparently after she was working in the lab, she would come, open the door, leaving traces of radium here, and then go and pull out her chair. Welcome to New Mexico. This is the Trinity bomb test site where the world's first nuclear bomb was set off. Right here, right in this spot. This whole area was vaporized. In fact, there was so much heat liberated by that bomb that it fused all of the desert sand into this green glass. And you can still find it here. They've actually named this mineral after the test. It's called trinitite. Yeah, this is the only place on Earth that this has ever been made. The level of radiation here is about 0.8 microsieverts an hour. The trinitite itself is a little bit more radioactive. I've got readings of 2 or 3 microsieverts an hour off them. Now, which place has higher levels of radiation than anywhere we've seen so far? The answer is an airplane. You know, as you gain altitude, there's less atmosphere above you to shield you from cosmic rays. So the level of radiation inside the plane can go up to 0.5 microsieverts per hour at 18,000 feet, up to 1 microsievert per hour at 23,000 feet, over 2 microsieverts per hour at 33,000 feet, and over 3 microsieverts per hour at even higher altitudes and towards the poles. That is Chernobyl nuclear reactor number 4. It melted down on April 26, 1986. So what happened was so much heat was generated inside that reactor that it basically blew the top off, spreading radioactive isotopes throughout this whole surrounding area and over into Europe. And that is why we can still detect the contamination here today. Now right now it's reading around 5 microsieverts an hour. If I stayed here for 1 hour, my body would receive a similar dose to what you'd receive when you get a dental x-ray. So this is not a huge amount of radiation. And one of the reasons why the radiation level is not too high is because they actually removed a couple meters worth of topsoil from this whole area. Then they dumped it somewhere. That's why we can stand here. We're driving into the Fukushima exclusion zone now. I'm just watching as the levels on my Geiger counter go up as we approach the zone. See those black bags at the side of the road? The Japanese are doing now exactly what the people in Chernobyl did, collecting up meters and meters of topsoil. The mask is probably overkill. It's just to stop radioactive dust from getting into my lungs. This is definitely one of the most radioactive places where I've been. Even though the release of radioactive material was less than Chernobyl, only about 10%. Because it's much fresher, only 3 years since the accident, much less of it has decayed. So I've been getting readings up around 5 to 10 microsieverts an hour. And I think we won't be staying here for too long because of that. I'm about to go into the hospital at Pripyat, and this is where the firemen were taken after they fought the fires at the Chernobyl reactor. And in the basement of this building, they have left all of the firemen's clothing. Once they realized it was so contaminated, they chucked it down there.
That shoe, 80.
But you can see there's a huge pile of that gear there.
Right outside the door, I'm getting 500 microsieverts an hour just outside the door. 1,500 microsieverts an hour. You know, if we stayed here for a couple hours, we'd receive our annual dose of background radiation.
That basement was the most radioactive place I visited, and it's one of the most radioactive places on Earth. If I'd stayed down there for 1 hour, I would have received 2,000 microsieverts. That's a year's worth of natural background radiation. Every yellow pixel here represents a banana. Now that might seem like a lot, but consider that in a CT scan, the patient receives about 7,000 microsieverts. That's 3 years worth of natural background radiation. It's been estimated that the people living around Fukushima will receive an additional 10,000 microsieverts over their lifetime due to the nuclear power disaster. For comparison, US radiation workers are limited to a maximum of 50,000 microsieverts per year. But that's less than another occupation, astronaut. An astronaut on the space station for 6 months will receive about 80,000 microsieverts worth of radiation. But not even they are exposed to the highest levels of ionizing radiation. So can you guess who is? The answer is a smoker's lungs. A smoker's lungs on average receive 160,000 microsieverts worth of radiation every year. That's due to the radioactive polonium and radioactive lead in the tobacco that they're smoking. So not only are they exposed to carcinogens and toxins, they also receive very high levels of radiation. So it's not the people of Fukushima or Chernobyl or radiation workers or even astronauts who receive the highest doses of ionizing radiation. That honor goes to your ordinary, average smoker.
After seeing the video, we know that the smoker's lungs is one of the most radioactive places on Earth. And that's true for the general public. A smoker by far is going to have probably the highest annual average dose of any individual in the general public. But I want to go over a few things just to, as a review from the video. First of all, Dr. Mueller talked in the International System of Units, the sievert. In the American government, industry, and generally in the general public, we talk in what's known as REM, Rankine Equivalent Man. And so a REM and a sievert mean a measure of the health effect of low levels of ionizing radiation on the human body. So essentially we're talking the same thing, the ionizing radiation to the human body. One's the international unit, the sievert, which is equal to 100 rem. So they have a different volume as far as quantity, as far as exposure, but essentially we're talking about damage to the human body. So since he spoke in sieverts, I'm going to stay in sieverts. But you'll have the conversion. I did a little bit more conversions to try and put it in perspective for health professionals. A sievert is equal to 100 rem. A chest x-ray is 0.0001 sieverts, or 1,000th of a sievert. Well, 1,000th of a sievert is 1 millisievert, and 1.1 millisieverts is 100 microsieverts. So he mostly talked in microsieverts because that's the unity of quantity. That's the level where he was talking about. So we're going to try and stay in those microsieverts unit. So a chest x-ray equals about 100 microsieverts of actual radiation exposure. They affect biological effects on the human body. In review, he talked about natural background. I want to put it in perspective for Illinois citizens, and this is pretty much true for everybody here in the Midwest, not only Illinois, but Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Generally in the Midwest, you're not going to see a big difference. If we grow corn and soybeans, they grow corn and soybeans. Our background radiation is about 1 microsievert. And there's actually an assessment that was done by Oak Ridge Associated Universities that you can find what the background radiation is for any state in the U.S. He also talked about other exposures that the general public's going to receive. Flying in an airplane at altitude for 1 hour is about 3 microsieverts. So, you know, he was using the bananas to represent units at that point. Naturally, background would be 1 banana. So 3 microsieverts would be about 30 bananas worth of exposure. Now we talk about that elevation. That's also interesting in the U.S. If you live at higher altitudes, for example, as in Denver, they're about 10 times our actual natural occurring background radiation that we see in Illinois. So in Denver, where we see 0.1 microsieverts, in Denver you're going to receive about 10 microsieverts in natural background. That has not only to do with the elevation, but also some of the rock and granite that's actually out in Denver, in the Denver area, in the upper plateau of Colorado. And then he talked about other radiation exposures. I was glad he brought up CT scans, about 7 microsieverts. That's something that most health professionals are going to be able to comprehend as a dose rate. Now he was actually talking about pixels. So literally we're talking about the size of the box here. So as you can see, as he went through, the boxes kept getting bigger. The very small box, may be difficult to read, is the background radiation, natural occurring background radiation. Then the CT scan is the next larger box. Then Fukushima, the actual exposure from living now around Fukushima. And then you got the U.S. radiation workers, and I highlight that. That's 50,000 microsieverts. So, you know, from a CT scan at 7,000 microsieverts, a U.S. radiation worker, this is from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the 10 CFR Code of Federal Regulations 20, a nuclear power plant worker in the U.S. is not allowed to receive more than 50,000 microsieverts annually. And then he measured an astronaut. He used 80,000. That's actually a 6-month exposure. If you were out in outer space, that's, you know, most people don't spend more than 6 months. But if you were in outer space for 6 months, you'd receive about 80,000 microsieverts. So you're receiving a much higher whole body dose. And then finally, he talked about a smoker's lungs, and he used this graphic with the 160,000 microsieverts. That's about average on a smoker, but it's really a difficult number to pin down. We can say an average, and it's a lot easier to say the average exposure of an individual than it is really a smoker. And I'm going to explain this in more detail as we go through the presentation, but really the 2 major factors is not only how many cigarettes they smoke, but also where the tobacco in the cigarette came from, because it's going to differ depending on what country the actual, and even what state in the U.S., where the tobacco came from, as to how much radioactivity is in that cigarette. And I'm going to explain about that difference in activity as we go along. So that's the most radioactive places on Earth. Now let's get into the two topics that we want to talk about. The actual exposure to the general public. The biggest source is going to be in cigarettes, so let's talk about the radiation source in cigarettes. Here is a map of where tobacco is grown worldwide. and the average regional tobacco output. So as you can see, we pretty much know in the U.S., Kentucky, West Virginia, the Virginias, Carolinas is where the majority of the tobacco is grown in the U.S. But you can also see there's quite a bit of tobacco grown in China, even in Europe, in different areas of Europe. So because the natural occurring background activity in those different areas is different, that's going to affect the amount of radioactivity that's actually in the cigarette. Tobacco in the field, tobacco plants are grown using fertilizers that contain a mineral called apatite, or the better way to put it, has high phosphorus minerals in it, phosphates in particular. And those phosphates are absorbed into the plant and into the leaves. The phosphates contain the radioactive element radium, which eventually decays into the radioactive isotope polonium-210. But tobacco plants do not only absorb the radioactive elements, they actually, the radioactive elements will attach from the air around them. The source is also radium from the fertilizer and from the natural occurring uranium that exists in the soil. The tobacco leaves are covered in sticky hairs, especially on the bottom of the leaf, making them especially good at catching elements from the atmosphere around them. Studies in countries all over the world have found significant levels of polonium in local tobacco brands. Is it possible to create a safe cigarette? Would it be possible if by different methods to remove the radioactivity from the cigarettes? Well, the simple answer is no. The tobacco industry has tried in vain to remove the radioactive element by not only washing the tobacco leaves, genetically modifying the plants, or using filters on the cigarettes themselves. None of these appear to have worked, and indeed, an independent Polish study found that filters absorb a very small amount of the polonium. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the radioactive decay chain of the radium-226, which is the major radium isotope that's in the soil. Radium's in the soil, it's going to be in the soil. It's produced by uranium that has over a 4 million year half-life. So uranium through a decay chain is constantly producing radium. Radium has a 1,600 year half-life. Now the interesting thing about radium, it's the last solid in the decay chain of uranium before the radioactive element radon. It's a noble gas, it's inert, so it's going to try and escape from the soil. So the radium is taken up into the tobacco leaf, and then the radon in the air also deposits radionuclides on the tobacco leaf. And then, not to spend a lot of time, it decays to polonium-218, an alpha decay to lead-214. And then it beta decays through bismuth, another isotope of polonium. That polonium isotope, polonium-214, alpha decays to lead-210. The real important thing in this series is that if you look next to each isotope, there are symbols. Remember I said radium had a 1,600 year half-life? Well, next to radon it has 3.82 days. And then we're talking minutes, and then believe it or not, if you look at polonium-214, it's microseconds. So pretty much all that's going to be out of the tobacco leaf by the time the end user, the smoker, actually smokes the cigarette. Because from the time it's picked in the field, by the time they dry it, process it, and goes through the retail process, all that's going to be decay away. But that lead-210 has a 22-year half-life. So that lead is still going to be present in the cigarette. And so as the smoker smokes that cigarette, that lead and the polonium ion, polonium-210, that's building up into that, because it has a 138-day half-life, is going to be in that tobacco, and it's going to be transported into the smoke. Okay? And that alpha particle, once it's trapped in the bronchial epithelium of the lung, that's what does the damage. That's the radiation source to the lung. After that, it decays to stable lead, so it's no longer producing any radiation that could damage the actual lung. So how much makes it into the lungs? Well, the tobacco contains the polonium-210 and the lead-210. It's still present in the actual tobacco leaf. These are decay products from radon, and they're present in the soil, and they're deposited on the leaves. The polonium and lead are actually volatilized due to the combustion of the tobacco, the actual burning of the tobacco. And only about 20% of the polonium and about 10% of the lead enter the lung through the main smoke stream. So all that polonium isn't actually getting into the lung, but we do know the amount of exposure that creates in the lung, the amount that actually makes it there. Okay, so a person smoking a half a pack of cigarettes, chose a half a pack because it's a nice even round number of 10 cigarettes per day. The radiation dose to the bronchial epithemia is about 55,000 microsieverts. And that's where, remember, Dr. Mueller said 160,000 microsieverts. Well, that's based on what an average smoker would smoke. And even pinning that number down depends on what country you're in, because the smoking rates, I'll get into this in my next section, but they vary so widely, not over the US, but over the world. It's very difficult to know without knowing the actual smoking rate of the smoker. But 10 cigarettes will create 55,000 microsieverts of exposure directly to the lung tissue. And we're talking directly to the lung. That same 10 cigarettes per day has a total effective radiation dose. So now we're talking about dose to the whole body. It's not only affecting the lung, but it's actually affecting the entire body, all the organs. It's about 180 microsieverts of annual exposure to the whole body. So this polonium, these alpha particles, are not only creating radiation exposure directly to the lung, but it actually exposes the rest of the tissue in our body, obviously at a much lower level, but it still creates a whole body dose. And so I want to make sure, because when we start talking about the average exposures to the general public, we understand that there's a difference between the dose directly to the lung and a dose to the entire body. Okay, so that's the radiation sources in cigarettes. Now here comes the tricky part, especially for me. I'm a health physicist. I'm not a smoking expert by any means, but it's very easy to find information and all kinds of information on the international and U.S. smoking rates. The World Health Organization puts out an annual report on the global tobacco epidemic, and they have these numbers available. And there's all kinds of sources that you can get different numbers. But I just wanted to try in general to put a perspective on it. So the average person worldwide smokes 1,083 cigarettes per year. Now, the vast majority of us aren't smokers, so the smokers are smoking a lot more. 1,083 is going to come up to be about 2.5, 3 cigarettes a day. But that's how many cigarettes average worldwide everybody's smoking. Not just the smokers, but on average, that's the total number of cigarettes. So I hope I make that clear. So China leads with an average of about 4,125 cigarettes per year. And believe it or not, in the U.S., we're not super good, but we're not really super bad. We're kind of middle of the pack. We're just a little bit above the actual average. On average in the U.S., about 688 cigarettes are smoked on average per year. Now that, once again, if you calculate that out to a day, it's about 3 cigarettes per day. So your smokers are smoking a lot of cigarettes on our behalf for the average person. Okay, so percentage of population smoking. To give you a worldwide perspective, this is a map, the keys in the lower left-hand corner, and it's percentage of the population that's smoking. So if you look at Eastern Europe and China, 40% of their population are smoking cigarettes. And if you think about what I said earlier, China's, the average person's over 4,000 cigarettes. They're making up a lot of cigarettes for the rest of the world as far as the average number of cigarettes smoked. And then we also get into an issue here of, although filters don't have a big effect, some people are smoking worldwide, not so much in the U.S., but more worldwide, are smoking filterless cigarettes in addition. So there's a lot more particles actually getting into the lung. Another interesting thing about all this is we're also not taking into account smokeless tobacco at all in any of the numbers that I'm quoting. I just looked at strictly smokers. There is some radiation dose accumulable and some use, a considerable amount of use in smokeless tobacco. And a little reference about cigar and smokes in pipe smoking. Essentially a full pipe, average pipe, or 1 cigar equals 5 cigarettes. So if you have somebody that you know that's smoking a cigar, well, I only smoke 4 cigars a day. Well, essentially you're smoking 2 packs, or a pack of cigarettes, I'm sorry. 1 pack of cigarettes a day by smoking 4 cigars. So your casual cigar smoker is, if they inhale, and there's a lot of different data on that, how much cigar smokers and pipe smokers actually inhale, but if they are smoking pipes or cigars, it's the equivalent of smoking 5 cigarettes for every cigar or pipe full of smoke. Okay, among current smokers, the adult smokers, and it depends on what study you're looking at. Some use age 14 or age 15, so we're as what an adult smoker is, somebody above that age. The proportion of those who smoke every day is about 76%. Now this is other smokers, 3/4 of them actually smoke every day. The average number of cigarettes smoked per day is 14.2. And then the proportion of daily smokers who smoke greater than 20 cigarettes per day is just under about a third. 29% is just under about a third of the smokers. 3 out of every 10 smoke greater than 20 cigarettes per day. Okay, and I'm sorry, this is from the CDC, so these are U.S. numbers. These are specifically, we're talking about cigarettes smoked in the U.S. And then here's a map that's available on the internet. The link's at the bottom of the page. And this gives you an average of the number of cigarettes. It varies very widely across the U.S. I believe Kentucky has the dubious honor of about 29% of the people in Kentucky smoke. And Utah out there, catch the brown state with the Great Salt Lake up there. Utah is only about 11% of the population actually smoke. So it does vary widely, even in the U.S. Here in Illinois, we're right at around 20%, but the average number of cigarettes is smoked is about 16.5 cigarettes by those who smoke in Illinois. Now that's one number I found very interesting. Even though in Utah they have a very low percentage of people smoking, the people who do smoke on average over a pack a day. So it's kind of a different balance there. But this is specific to any state, depending on where you're at watching the video. But Illinois numbers, we're just about mid-range average across as compared to the rest of the U.S. Okay, so when we look at that 160,000 microsieverts, that number's not very easily pinned down. You know, we know how much a radiation worker in the U.S. is expected. We know what background radiation is. We know the radioactivity of different exposures, different occupations. But smokers are much more difficult to pin down because not only can the radon concentration as the tobacco, depending on where it was grown in the world, vary, but also how much they smoke and what type of smoking they do, how often they smoke varies worldwide. So yes, 160,000 is probably somewhere close to an average, but it's going to vary greatly from patient to patient. Most doctors have a questionnaire, do they smoke and how many cigarettes do you smoke? So you can get a determination of exactly what their overall risk is. Now, what's radon's role in radiation to the lung? Well, here's a different graph. It's the exact same chart, just presented differently than I presented earlier. And instead of starting with radium, I started with radon. And radon is a natural occurring radioactive gas that occurs from the decay of uranium, the uranium chain, throughout the country. States vary differently, so not only do smoking rates vary, so do the uranium concentrations in soil and ultimately the radon gas concentration. And what makes Illinois a great place to grow corn and soybeans, the glacial till that was pushed down during the Ice Age, gave us that uranium in our soil, and that's our biggest problem. Our number one message is that uranium varies not only state to state, county to county, city to city, it varies on the lot that a home's built on. So the only way to know what a radon concentration is in any individual home is to test each and every one of those individual homes. But now here's where radon differs from the radiation in tobacco. If you look at this decay chain, once again, I put the two yellow, the little graphic, it's a graphic with two yellow balls and two red balls. That represents the helium nucleus the nucleus of a helium atom, which is 2 protons and 2 neutrons. That's what an alpha particle actually is. And in smoking, we said the only alpha particle that's going to be processed into the cigarette is that one that's emitted by the polonium-210. Radon in the home is different. the radon comes in as a natural occurring radioactive gas into our homes. It's going to emit an alpha particle. But the time that that radon gas is actually in your lung, you're going to be breathing it in and breathing it out. It's not very likely that that's going to be the primary alpha particle. What actually happens in our homes is that radon decays to these decay products, and all these decay products are electrostatically charged particles. So they attach to the very fine dust in the air. We breathe that dust into our lung, and that dust gets trapped in the bronchial epithelium of the lung. Now think about this with a smoker. Not only is he getting the polonium-210 from the cigarette, they're also, the smoke that they're inhaling is attaching the rest of the radon decay products to the smoke, and they're deep in inhaling that into their lungs, and it gets trapped in that bronchial epithelium. So they're most likely not getting the alpha particle from the radon gas itself, but now they're getting all the polonium alpha particles, those other three, the polonium-218 alpha particle, the polonium-214 alpha particle, and also the polonium-210 alpha particle. So they're getting a much bigger radiation dose depending on the decay time and how long, because the percentage of those are decaying away before they ever get into the lung. So it's going to vary depending on how close they are to the actual source of radon entry. We usually find higher radon concentrations in the lower part of the building. Obviously, those decay products like the radon move up through the building, but the longer it takes to move up, the more it's decayed away, so the less that you're going to find on the upper levels of a private home. But they're still being exposed, or potential exposure, to all three of those alpha particles. Background in Illinois, our highest radon measurement is 1,307 picocuries in Peoria County. But if you look at the large X's, they're kind of color-coded to the results in the chart next to the map. We found very high radon concentrations all over the states. And I point these out. These are the highest radon measurements. On average in Illinois, the average radon concentration in a home is 4.7 picocuries per liter. I'm going to discuss that in some more detail, the exposure risk from that. But just note that we do have people all over the state who are routinely seeing 100 picocuries per liter or more radon in their private homes. So and that is a very appreciable dose. The 4 picocuries is an appreciable dose to the average public. But when you get over 100, that's really of a concern. So let's talk, remember we started this whole discussion about what people perceive as what their radiation exposures are. So this source is the National Council on Radiation Protection, and this is the average exposure of the general public to all the different sources that they receive. As you can see, radon's 37%, and then let's kind of jump around here. If you look at the green and the two different lighter blues are medical uses, the CAT scans, the nuclear medicine, and the medical x-rays. They make up just about the same amount total, a little bit more than radon. We can't say it enough to the general public. The benefits of those those radiation sources used in the medical field, the benefits by far outweigh the risks associated with that radiation exposure. So we would never want to say to the public, you shouldn't receive that radiation dose. The benefits far outweigh. The other sources, there are real no benefits to them, specifically radon. There's no known benefit to the radiation exposure. And I put the big blue arrow on my notes there on the side to point out that's at 1.3 picocuries per liter. Okay, that's the average natural indoor radon concentration. Even if it's at the average, the national average, 37%, over a third of your exposure comes from radon gas. And that 6,200 microsieverts of radiation exposure, that's whole body. Once again, that's not the dose to the lung, that's whole body exposure. So a third of that whole body exposure actually comes from radon. Now let's look at if we take it to the action level for radon. 4 picocuries per liter is the action level for radon exposure in the U.S. That jumps that total radiation exposure, average exposure, up to the whole body to 11,700 microsieverts. Remember, we said a CAT scan is 7,000 microsieverts. So that jumps that up to 11,700 microsieverts. And almost 2/3 of the radiation exposure comes from radon, by far the biggest source to the general public. So what is that in dose to the lung? Remember we said smoking was about 50,000 microsieverts for a pack of cigarettes? Well, for radon, the annual equivalent dose to the lung will be 75,000 microsieverts. So if somebody's smoking 10 cigarettes a day and then has a radon concentration of 4 picocuries per liter, you're essentially saying they just jumped up to smoking a full pack of cigarettes per day, the combination of the two. And we consider them synergistic because we're deep inhaling that smoke and we're trapping more radon decay products in the smoke at the same time. So radon is a significant dose to the general public, equivalent to smoking cigarettes. So now let's look at the Environmental Protection Agency. They came out with an estimate some years back to try and put it in perspective for the public. So I give you this graphic. At 4 picocuries per liter, it's equal to about 200 chest x-rays a year for you medical professionals, or an average about 8 cigarettes per day. So another easy number to remember, I always help, it is proportionate. So if a pack is for every 10 picocuries per liter of radon, it's the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes per day. 10 picocuries per liter is a pack of cigarettes per day, or 20 cigarettes. And then, as you can see, it is proportionate. At 20 picocuries, it's 1,000 chest x-rays, or 40 cigarettes, or 2 packs of cigarettes per day. So when we talk about homeowners being at 100 picocuries per liter, we're talking at a level of smoking 10 packs of cigarettes per day as far as their radiation risk. So clearly the two largest sources of radiation exposure to the public, one is if you smoke, is smoking, and two, if you have high radon concentrations, that's going to be controllable. That's going to be your leading source of radiation exposure. To kind of try and now put this in perspective for you, let's talk about how much energy that alpha particle has. This is a chip of plastic that has been magnified 100 times. The plastic, the little dark circles on it are the pits that are actually created in the plastic by the alpha particle hitting the plastic. That's how much energy that alpha particle has. It has enough energy to put a pit into the plastic. Imagine what that can do to the cell structure. It'll actually cause a double helical break in the DNA structure. So we're talking about an amazing amount of energy that alpha particle has. And that's why its risk is so great internal to the body. That alpha particle doesn't have enough energy to penetrate the outside of our skin, but when you put it down at the bronchial epithemia, right at the cellular level, that alpha particle can hit individual cells and cause damage. And lastly, I'd like to finish with one more YouTube presentation or video that kind of helps put it in everything into perspective. So I'll go ahead and try and start this one if our link works for us here. Okay, so now we're looking into a cloud chamber, and the bottom of the chamber is actually cooled to about minus 35 degrees centigrade or colder. Alcohol is placed in the chamber, and it wicks up the inside and then diffuses downward. And as it gets to the bottom of the chamber, it turns into supersaturated vapor. And so what we're actually going to see in the cloud chamber, the little streaks as they're moving across the cloud chamber, is actually the vapor trail left by the alpha particle as it moves through the cloud chamber. So what we're looking at here is the vapor trail. Just like you see a vapor trail when a plane's flying in a nice clear blue sky, you see the vapor trail behind the plane. That's what you're seeing in the cloud chamber. We have this supersaturated cloud. We have an alpha particle travel through it, and we can actually see that alpha particle. So what we're actually seeing in this chamber, this was set up in a classroom, and so we're just seeing natural occurring background radiation. And those big heavy streaks are those alpha particles. You can kind of see the cloud moving at the bottom of the chamber, but those big heavy streaks are actually the alpha particles moving through the cloud chamber. And so we can actually see that radioactivity, get a perspective of what's actually occurring in the lung. Now the professor is actually setting the cloud chamber up on a bed in a basement bedroom. This is what the cloud chamber looks like in 100 picocuries per liter home. There's no radiation source inside the chamber. He just put the lid on, and that's the decay of the radon and the radon decay products inside the cloud chamber. That's what's actually occurring inside your lung. That's the number of decays, and that decay occurs continuously as long as that home is at that 100 picocurie per liter radiation source. So that's risk and perspective. That's what we're talking about, radiation exposure to the general public. I thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, let me go back to my final slide, and that's my direct contact information. If you have questions, feel free to contact me directly. Once again, I work for the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and so you can contact me in my state office. Thank you.